Hello internet users and welcome back to another video. Today I'm once again going to be talking about a Castlevania game. If you know me, you'll know that Castlevania was never really a franchise I grew up with, and I ended up getting into the games a lot later than most other people. The main reason I first got into the series was because of how much I enjoyed the Metroidvania-styled ones, but there's no denying that the classic entries are worth visiting too. When you take a look at Castlevania's legacy, it's a bit sad to see that the traditional stage-based ones are arguably the most neglected. For the past 2 decades, the only love they've seen has been in the form of remakes. And I don't mean to discredit these games, but it would have been nice to have seen some brand new takes on the original formula. Well, at the very least, I guess we have Bloodstained for that now. But anyways, diving into the world of older Castlevania games, the one I want to focus on today is the lone entry that appeared on the Sega Genesis, Castlevania Bloodlines. In my opinion, Bloodlines is not only a great Castlevania game, but it's also one of the best side-scrollers that I've played from the 16-bit era. Its gameplay is pretty straightforward. You advance through each stage, defeating demonic creatures, platforming through death traps, and then have to fight a boss at the end. Compared to other Castlevania games available at the time, this may seem pretty standard, but there were quite a few things that made Bloodlines stand out and have its own identity. And the best way to discuss and cover all of those things is to start right from the beginning. So here are my thoughts on Castlevania Bloodlines. Bloodlines takes place in the year 1917, during the First World War. A vampire named Elizabeth Bartley plans to resurrect Count Dracula, who is also her uncle. To do so, she plans to recruit the help of other demons all across Europe. However, 2 men have set out to stop her, John Morris and Eric Lecard, both of which are descendants of the Belmont family, and have sworn to hunt and destroy the creatures of the night. We're then greeted by an eerie title screen that has a giant pool of blood, with even more dripping down from the game's logo. Unless you're playing the European version, where instead it's just some nice, non-threatening water. When starting the game, you have the option to play as either John or Eric, who each have different weapons and play very differently. John uses the legendary whip that's been passed down through the Belmont family, the Vampire Killer. He plays just like a traditional Castlevania character, wielding the whip like a Belmont would in the other games. However, in Bloodlines, he also has the ability to latch onto ceilings, allowing him to swing around and be a bit more agile than his ancestors. Eric uses the Alucard Spear, although in this game it's actually mistranslated as Alcard Spear. If it wasn't obvious from the name, this weapon was made by Alucard, who gave it to the Lecard family to assist the inheritors of the Vampire Killer. Eric also moves a bit faster than John, and his spear can also reach a bit further than the whip. While Eric is on the ground, he can stab upwards and diagonally, unlike John, who can only attack upwards while he's jumping. However, by far, the biggest thing that Eric has over John is his super jump. By crouching for a second, he will charge up. Releasing your input will make him do a jumping attack, which is incredibly handy for elevating yourself to higher platforms, and in some cases even letting you skip a small amount of platforming if you know what you're doing. Both characters also have a downward attack while they're in the air, but I found you'll almost never have a use for it. After all the time I've spent with this game, I found that both characters are pretty fun to use, but if you're playing for the first time, Eric is definitely the one to start with, especially since you can't switch characters without starting a new game. And fun fact about these two, according to the game's instruction manual, what made John and Eric become vampire hunters was seeing John's father, Quincy Morris, defeat Dracula years ago in 1897. This is a nod to the scene and character from Bram Stoker's original Dracula novel. Another neat tidbit involves the character Elizabeth Bartley, who is based on the real-life person, Elizabeth Bathory, a woman who is known for having committed some really disturbing crimes, and it's no surprise that she's often depicted as an evil vampire in modern media. Looking at the Japanese version of this game, it seems that this character's last name was meant to just straight up be Bathory, and Bartley appears to be another mistranslation. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's take a look at how the first stage opens up. The game begins where you might expect it to, at the entrance of Dracula's castle. This time, however, with its master currently dead, it's in complete ruins and looks to be falling apart. Right at the start, as you approach the castle's entrance, there are crows that fly away when you get near. And once you're at the door, you'll find that the last crows were feasting on a bloody corpse. A really nice touch if you ask me. Like in other Castlevania games, you're able to pick up and use sub-weapons. In Bloodlines, there are a total of 3. The Axe, Holy Water, and Boomerang. It should be noted that the character you're playing as doesn't change how they work at all. Using a sub-weapon consumes a crystal. These are found by breaking the candles you see throughout every stage. The small red ones are worth 1, and the blue ones are worth 5. For whatever reason, Bloodlines uses crystals for this purpose instead of hearts. One thing that should be noted about the sub-weapons is that if you hold up when you press the button, you'll perform a stronger version of the attack, but at the cost of a few crystals instead of one. It's kind of like Richter's item crash in Rondo of Blood, but to a much lesser degree. Aside from crystals, another thing you'll often get from the candles is upgrades to your character's main weapon. Collecting these will make your attack stronger, and also extend their reach a bit more. You can enhance your weapon a few times, and it will stay that way until you lose a life. However, the final upgrade is a different story. When your weapon is fully powered up, it will start to glow with this greenish fiery aura. In this form, your sub-weapon will be replaced with a special attack that can pretty much clear the screen for you in an instant. Be careful though, as if you take a single hit, you'll lose the aura and return to your previous level of strength. As well, picking up another sub-weapon will replace the special attack, so you'll want to avoid that as well. You have to play really well to both earn and keep these abilities, so it can be really frustrating when you finally take that one hit that makes you lose it all. But that's nothing compared to when you die in this game. Dying in Castlevania has always been pretty punishing, and in Bloodlines that hasn't changed. There are a handful of checkpoints you'll respawn at, but whenever you lose a life, you'll also lose all of your crystals, your sub-weapon, and your main weapon will return to its weakest form. I both really like and hate these ideas. On one hand, I think it's a good design choice to reward the player for being really good at the game, but on the other, I think it's so frustrating to make it really far into a stage only to lose everything you've collected due to messing up a single jump. Then when you continue, you'll have to fight the boss using a weaker weapon and possessing only a couple of crystals. Even if you fully memorize the boss's patterns and can beat it pretty easily, it still hurts knowing you could have walked into it in a much stronger state. Coming back to play this game recently, I felt like I would never be satisfied until I could get through the whole game in just one life. Overall though, Bloodlines actually has a pretty fair and balanced difficulty. The game never feels cheap, and when you mess up, you definitely feel like it's your fault. Another thing to keep in mind is that there aren't many healing items scattered around the stages. Every hit matters, and this is not a game where you can just tank hits. Something else that I really like about Bloodlines is how it doesn't have as many death pits as the other games. Sure, a lot of the enemy placement is designed to punish you for being too reckless, but it didn't feel like many of them were specifically positioned to knock you into instant death. Which is fine by me, as that is easily my least favorite part of the older games. But moving on, the next thing I want to talk about is some of the interesting ideas this game has with its visuals. This game doesn't have any sort of cutscenes or story presented to you between levels, but based on the short intro and the other bits and pieces from the back of the box, and the instruction booklet, it's implied that John and Eric are chasing Elizabeth all across Europe, as she attempts to gather what she needs to resurrect Dracula. Each stage has you visiting different locations, where the vampire has unleashed hordes of monsters for the pair to face. Stage 2 is the lost city of Atlantis in Greece. Stage 3 is the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy. Stage 4 is a munitions factory in Germany. Stage 5 is the Palace of Versailles in France. And the last stage is Elizabeth's Castle in England. Ordinarily, the majority of a Castlevania game takes place inside of Dracula's castle, so the way they split up the levels in Bloodlines is definitely another thing that makes the game stand out a bit more from the rest. Each of the different stages have a ton of visual variety, and it really feels like the developers experimented quite a bit with this game. In the Atlantis stage, there is a very unique screen where the water moves up and down while reflecting what's above. In the Leaning Tower of Pisa stage, there is a part where in order to continue climbing, you have to jump along these floating platforms. As you do this though, you can see the tower turning in the background, simulating the effect that you're circling it as you climb. Another thing you can see in this stage is that the Minotaur enemy can interact with the environment, ripping out a column and using it as a weapon. And when you're first outside the Palace of Versailles, the fountain will suddenly be filled with blood instead of water, and red skeletons will attack you. Unless you're playing the European version, where blood is not allowed to exist. Many of these visuals were really impressive for the time, and what's also really crazy about them is how little each one is used. Despite clearly putting so much effort into these cool touches, the backgrounds and the enemies and their animations, most of them you'll only ever see for just one screen in the whole game. Bloodlines really goes the extra mile, and it shows. Although, as much as I really have to give points for ambition, there are some places that these ideas are really going to be hit or miss for a lot of people. For instance, what is easily my least favorite part of this game is the boss of Stage 3. While you're at the top of the tower, you have to defeat this gargoyle, and while it's already bad enough that you don't have much space to move around, the game tries to simulate the idea that your character is always facing the creature as it flies around you. As a result, your character moves around slightly depending on how the boss moves. I'm sure this looked really impressive at the time, but looking at it now, it certainly hasn't aged very well. The first time I got to this part, I just got dizzy trying to look at it. I really don't think that there is a good reason for why the tower should be spinning during this fight. And just to clarify, I did get used to it and can actually beat this boss really easily now. But I feel I need to say that because a lot of people apparently think that calling something unnecessary means I'm saying it's too hard or something. The gimmick definitely doesn't make it unfair, but I think this idea could have been executed in a much better way. But while we're on the subject of boss fights, the rest of them are actually pretty good. Stage 1 only has a generic armored warrior, but it does its job just fine. Stage 2 has you fighting this really weird golem. In order to damage it, you need to hit its eye, but to do that, you need to chip away its body until it's short enough to reach. I know this thing is supposed to be made out of rocks, but the sound effects in this game make it feel like I'm hitting something made out of slime or something. Stage 4 has this monster made out of 3D gears. Again, a cool effect for the time, but nowadays this is a pretty underwhelming monster design. Aside from the look though, the fight is still pretty good by Castlevania standards. Its only gimmick is that it moves around a lot during its animations, just to show off how cool its 3D shapes are. Stage 5 has the figure of a woman float into the screen. After hitting it a few times, it then transforms into a giant moth monster. It's nothing too difficult, but when it does this attack where it drops poisonous powder down onto you, I found it a little hard to see at first. The final stage of the game contains multiple boss battles you'll need to deal with. There is some gimmicky platforming at the first part though, including an upside down room. I remember these rooms being really annoying when I first played the game, but they were much more manageable when I was playing through again. I also really like the music for this stage. It's definitely very fitting as the theme for someone marching into a final battle. The boss fights begin when you reach the long staircase. The first is against Death. In Bloodlines, he will have multiple cards circle around him and you'll need to hit them. The skull cards will cause him to attack you, and on normal mode, one of the cards will spawn a bunch of healing items when you hit it. The rest of the cards will cause you to be transported to a different arena where you'll have to fight a weaker version of one of the game's bosses. There is only 3 of them though, the Golem, the Gargoyle, and the Gear Monster. Once all of those bosses are defeated and all of the cards have been activated, you'll then need to fight Death himself. This might seem like a pretty brutal part to get through, but if you know the patterns, it's not too difficult to clear the bosses again. And as long as you're careful about which cards you hit, you can conserve the healing card for later. And if you die in the part against Death, as long as you still have lives, when you re-enter the room, you won't have to worry about dealing with the cards again. Once Death is taken care of, continuing to climb the staircase will bring you to Elizabeth. Her first form is a giant Medusa monster. This part is actually pretty easy, you just need to know where to stand and when to jump to avoid her. Once this form is defeated, she returns to normal and will start throwing these magic orbs around. Every time you hit her, one of the orbs will disappear. When any of them reach the center, an attack will happen and you'll have to try to avoid it. This phase also isn't too hard. You're pretty much just running back and forth hitting her. Once you know this, her orbs can be ignored, as they'll never be able to trigger an attack if you do it right. Moving on to the next screen, you're greeted with the final staircase that leads to Count Dracula. And for this brief moment, the game sets the tone by playing Simon Belmont's theme from Castlevania 4. Although Elizabeth was defeated, she clearly succeeded in bringing back the Count, and he isn't ready to go down easy. Dracula has 3 different forms in this game. His first is pretty familiar. He'll constantly teleport around shooting 3 fireballs out of his cape. As long as you time your attacks and hit him just as he raises his head, you'll hit the fireballs as well, and he'll never be able to hit you. For his second form, he will start using magic attacks. It's pretty easy to land hits as he flies around the screen. And if you're playing as Eric, you're always guaranteed a free hit if you continuously stab upward while he changes from his first form. For the final phase of the fight, he will transform into his true demon form. Believe me, it's very easy to panic at this point, but it's still just a matter of knowing where to stand and when to jump to dodge his attacks. The axe subweapon is also pretty handy here, but using it causes the game to lag a bit. There is obviously a lot of stuff happening on screen, so it's not too surprising. One way to make this fight, as well as the previous two, much easier, is to go up and down the stairs. Doing this screen transition will cause the candles to respawn, letting you farm as many crystals and weapon upgrades as you want. You'll definitely want to do this if you die and lose everything you had before. The game definitely shows you a bit of mercy when it throws you into this boss rush. Once he's finished off, you'll return to his chamber. It's here that you'll be rewarded with an ending. I use the term rewarded pretty loosely though, as it's hardly worth all the effort you went through. When you beat the game with Eric, you just get a single sentence saying that he fulfilled his destiny as a vampire hunter. Beating it with John just says the resurrection of Dracula has been averted. That's it. A single sentence is all you get. Unless you beat the entire game again on expert mode, where instead you get a second screen with a second sentence. Don't worry though, we do know what happens to John and Eric after the events of this game, but that's gonna have to wait for another video. For the record though, expert mode doesn't offer any new stages or boss battles. It mostly just seems like there are more enemies than there is in normal mode. Also, during the death boss battle, there isn't any way to heal yourself. To unlock expert mode, you have to beat the game once. But a much faster way is to just input the Konami code on the title screen. Speaking of codes, there is one other secret in this game that's pretty cool. To do it, first go into the options menu and select background music number 5, and then sound effect number 73. Now when you collect the final weapon upgrade, as in the special one that gives your weapon the glowing aura, the background music will change into one of 3 classic Castlevania songs. This includes Vampire Killer from the first game, Bloody Tears from the second, and Beginning from the third. The music will play for as long as you have the special upgrade, so taking a hit now will feel just a bit more punishing. There's no way you'd know about this unless you looked it up on the internet, or happened to read about it in a gaming magazine back in the day. In conclusion, Castlevania Bloodlines is a really fantastic game. I think it offers a good mix of style and substance and is pretty well balanced in terms of difficulty. It can no doubt be frustrating at times, but it's definitely worth playing. Because it's a Castlevania game, it also goes without saying that there is a lot of great music, some of which would appear in future entries in the series. The only real problem with this game is its availability. Like I said, it was originally released for the Genesis, but since then, it hasn't been re-released on any other platform, which is a pretty big shame. But anyway, that's all I have to say about it. My name is Pikasprey, and thanks for watching.